When Lisa walked through the door with that grin, the one she used to flash when she had a surprise for me, I knew something big was coming. She tossed an envelope onto the table, letting it slide across the surface until it stopped right in front of me. "Open it," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. Inside were tickets to the Super Bowl. I must have stared at them for a full minute before I looked up. "Are these real?" "Of course, they're real." Lisa laughed. "I thought you'd be more excited." Excited didn't begin to cover it. Football had been my passion since I could remember. Growing up, Sunday games were sacred. My dad and I would sit on the couch, bowls of chips between us, shouting at the TV like the players could actually hear us. Attending a Super Bowl game was something I'd always dreamed about but never thought would actually happen. "How did you even get these?" I asked, still staring at the tickets as if they might disappear. "Connections," she said with a wink. "A client at work couldn't go and thought of me." Lisa worked in PR and was always talking about her high-profile clients, though I never paid much attention. Her work often involved events and late nights, but I'd always figured that came with the territory. "I figured we could make it a group thing," she continued. "Amy and Paul can come with us. You remember Paul, right? He's the one who helped me with the fundraiser last month." I vaguely remembered Lisa mentioning Paul in passing. He was a friend of Amy's, someone she'd recently started hanging out with more. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Amy had been Lisa's best friend since college, and her circle of friends shifted every now and then. "Sounds perfect," I said, pulling her into a hug. "I can't believe you did this." "Thank you." Her smile was warm, but there was something behind her eyes I couldn't quite place. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the subtle changes in her demeanor. The weeks leading up to the game felt like an eternity. I pored over stats and predictions, debating the odds with my buddies at work. Lisa seemed excited too, though she didn't share my passion for the game. She was always checking in, asking if I had everything ready and reminding me that Amy and Paul would be joining us. "Paul's such a big fan too," she said one night over dinner. "You'll probably end up talking football with him the whole time." "That sounds great," I replied, not giving it much thought. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Lisa had been pulling away. Over the past few months, her late nights had become more frequent. She always had an explanation: work dinners, client meetings, girls' nights out, but the excuses started to blur together. One night, I noticed her phone light up with a text message. She was in the shower, so I glanced at the screen. It was from Amy: "Don't forget to delete the pics." It struck me as odd, but I didn't press her about it. After all, we'd been married for 8 years, and trust was the foundation of our relationship. Everyone has private moments, I told myself. Maybe I was overthinking it. The stadium felt alive. The cheers of thousands of fans blended into a deafening roar, the kind that made your heart race even if you weren't a football fan. For me, it was paradise. I was in awe of the sheer energy surrounding us, the kind of moment I'd dreamed of experiencing since I was a kid. Lisa sat beside me, dressed in a jersey I'd bought her years ago, her smile wide and carefree. She'd been laughing and chatting with Amy and Paul, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in weeks. Paul was a new addition to our group. He wasn't someone I'd known well, but Lisa had insisted he'd be a good fit for the outing. "He's a big football fan," she told me. I'll admit, the guy had a charm about him, a laid-back confidence that seemed to put everyone at ease. He joked with Amy and Lisa, making them laugh more than they normally would. I told myself it was nothing. Lisa and I had been together for years, and I trusted her. Paul was just one of those guys who could light up a room. But as the game went on, I started to notice small things, like the way Lisa leaned closer to him when she laughed, or how their conversation seemed quieter, more private. I brushed it off. This was supposed to be a perfect day, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin it. When halftime came, the energy in the stadium reached a fever pitch. The crowd buzzed as the performers took the stage, their voices booming through the speakers. It was a spectacle, but I figured it was a good time to grab another beer. Leaning over to Lisa, I asked, "Need anything from the concessions?" She shook her head, her eyes flicking toward her phone. "I'm good. I might head to the restroom, though." "All right," I said, squeezing her shoulder before making my way to the concession stand. The lines were packed with fans rushing to get drinks and snacks before the game resumed. I stood there, feeling a little impatient but still riding the high of being here. The Super Bowl wasn't just a game, it was an event, and I wanted to soak up every second of it. By the time I got my beer, I figured I'd hit the restroom myself before heading back to my seat. As I walked down the corridor, weaving through the crowd, something caught my attention. Lisa's seat was empty. She's probably at the concessions, I thought. But when I reached the restroom area, I noticed her slipping into a side entrance. It struck me as odd. That restroom wasn't even marked for general use, it looked like one of those staff access-only areas. My first instinct was to brush it off. Maybe she needed a quieter spot. But then I heard it, a soft, muffled laugh that stopped me in my tracks. Lisa's laugh. My heart started to pound as I moved closer. The noise was faint, but it grew clearer with each step. A giggle. A hushed voice. And then, a sound that sent a chill through me, a moan. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect to hear in a public restroom, much less from your wife. My stomach twisted, my brain scrambling to make sense of it. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe it wasn't her. But deep down, I knew. I stopped outside the restroom door, unsure whether to barge in or walk away. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my pulse hammering in my ears. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open just enough to see inside. And there she was. Lisa. My wife. She was pressed against the wall, her hands tangled in Paul's shirt as they kissed like two people who couldn't get enough of each other. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer. I froze. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. The woman I'd built a life with, the woman I'd loved and trusted for 8 years, was standing right there, betraying me in the most intimate way possible. I wanted to storm in, to rip Paul away from her, to demand an explanation. But my body refused to move. Instead, I just stood there, paralyzed by shock and anger and heartbreak, watching the life I thought I had crumble before my eyes. Lisa's voice broke through the fog in my head. "We need to hurry," she whispered, her tone urgent but playful. "He'll be back soon." "He's not gonna come in here," Paul replied, his voice low and confident. "Relax." My grip tightened around the beer cup in my hand, the plastic creaking under the pressure. I couldn't listen to any more. I stepped back, letting the door swing shut as quietly as it had opened. The walk back to my seat felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream, or a nightmare. The sounds of the stadium seemed distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. My mind replayed the scene over and over, each time twisting the knife a little deeper. The game, the roaring crowd, the energy that had electrified me earlier, all of it blurred into nothing. The cheers and commentary became white noise. I sat there, still and silent, while the images of Lisa and Paul played on a relentless loop in my mind. She'd returned to her seat during the third quarter, her face calm and cheerful, as though nothing had happened. I remember her leaning close, nudging my arm. "What did I miss?" she asked, her voice light, playful. I forced a smile. "Not much," I said. The words felt foreign in my mouth. She laughed, settling back into her seat and resuming her conversation with Amy. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, wondering how she could sit there, so casual, so unbothered, as if the life we built wasn't crumbling beneath my feet. I couldn't confront her. Not here, not now. The thought of making a scene in front of thousands of people, of giving her the satisfaction of seeing me break, was unbearable. So, I sat there, my eyes fixed on the field, pretending to watch the game. When the final whistle blew and the crowd erupted into cheers, I felt nothing. Lisa turned to me, her eyes sparkling as she joined in the celebration. "That was amazing, wasn't it?" she said, looping her arm through mine. "Yeah," I mumbled. As we made our way out of the stadium, Lisa chattered away about the game, the halftime show, even the snacks. Amy and Paul walked ahead of us, laughing and joking, oblivious, or so it seemed, to the storm raging inside me. The drive home was quiet. Lisa was glued to her phone, smiling occasionally at whatever she was reading. I glanced over at her, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and heartbreak. Was she texting him now? Reliving their little escapade while I sat beside her like a fool. By the time we pulled into the driveway, my mind was made up. I needed answers. Lisa went straight to bed, claiming exhaustion from the long day. I watched her disappear down the hallway, her footsteps soft on the carpet. As soon as I heard the bedroom door close, I grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. She'd given me the password years ago, back when trust between us had been effortless. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her messages, dreading what I might find. It didn't take long. The texts between Lisa and Paul were right there, bold and damning. "Paul, can't stop thinking about you." Lisa, "Me too. Today was perfect." My stomach twisted. I scrolled further back, my eyes scanning the stream of messages. Plans to meet up, late-night exchanges of explicit photos, inside jokes about sneaking around behind my back. And then there were the messages from that day. "Lisa, let's find a moment alone during halftime." "Paul, you read my mind." "Meet me by the staff restroom, winky face." The words burned into my brain, each one a hammer blow to the foundation of our marriage. This wasn't a moment of weakness, a single lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. Calculated. I felt sick. I sat in the dark living room for hours, my mind a chaotic mess. Anger, sadness, disbelief, they all fought for control. How could she do this? How long had I been blind to the truth? I thought about the nights she'd come home late, her excuses about work and friends. I thought about the times I'd kissed her goodbye, trusting her implicitly, while she was sneaking off to be with him. Our entire relationship felt like a lie. But the anger, oh, the anger burned hotter than anything else. I wasn't just angry at her betrayal. I was angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, for trusting her so completely. By the time the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the blinds, I'd made up my mind. This wasn't something I could ignore or forgive. But I wouldn't confront her yet. Not until I had every piece of evidence I needed to expose her lies. Over the next few days, I began to put together the puzzle. I backed up her messages, saved screenshots of her conversations with Paul, and even pulled up bank statements showing suspicious transactions, dinners, hotel stays, and unexplained withdrawals. Every piece of evidence added to the weight in my chest, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know the full scope of her betrayal. Meanwhile, Lisa carried on as if nothing was wrong. She'd smile at me over breakfast, kiss my cheek before heading out the door, and text me during the day like everything was normal. It was almost impressive, the way she could compartmentalize her deceit. One evening, I overheard her on the phone with Amy. "Yeah, the game was amazing," she said, her tone bright. "It was so much fun hanging out with you guys. Paul's hilarious, isn't he? I can't believe he was single for so long." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. How could she talk so casually about the man she was cheating on me with? The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed beside her, knowing what I knew, felt like torture. I wanted to shake her awake, to demand answers, to make her face the damage she'd caused. But I held back. Not yet. Instead, I started to prepare. I reached out to a divorce attorney, explaining the situation and sharing the evidence I'd gathered. They assured me that the texts, photos, and financial records would make a strong case in my favor. I also began to reach out to friends and family, subtly laying the groundwork for what was to come. Lisa and I are going through a rough patch, I'd say, testing the waters. Their responses varied, but one thing became clear: I wasn't alone in this. The illusion of my marriage was shattered, and the pain of that realization was almost unbearable. But amid the heartbreak, a new determination began to take root. Lisa had made her choices, and now it was my turn. She thought she could deceive me, that she could live this double life without consequences. But she was wrong. I wasn't going to let her destroy me. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the curtains, I sat at the kitchen table, waiting. Lisa came in wearing her usual smile, reaching for the coffee pot like it was any other day. "Morning," she said casually, not a trace of guilt on her face. "Morning," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She froze for a moment, her hand lingering on the coffee pot. "About what?" "About halftime." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. I watched her closely, waiting for the flicker of recognition. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured the coffee, but she kept her tone steady. "What about halftime?" she asked, avoiding eye contact. "I saw you," I said simply. "In the restroom. With Paul." Lisa's breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it. Instead, she laughed nervously. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "Don't play dumb, Lisa. I saw you. And I went through your phone." That was the final blow. Her expression crumbled, the facade of innocence she'd been wearing shattering before my eyes. She sank into the chair across from me, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. "It was a mistake," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I swear, it didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice quiet but sharp. "You've been sneaking around for months, lying to me, and it didn't mean anything?" "I was feeling neglected," she sobbed. "You're always so busy with work," and I felt invisible. Paul was there for me. Neglected. That word hit me like a slap. I worked long hours to provide for us, to give her the life she wanted. I'd gone out of my way to make sure she was happy, to show her how much I cared. And this was her excuse. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just stood up, her excuses ringing hollow in my ears. "I need some air," I said, walking out of the room before the anger boiling inside me could spill over. In the days that followed, I threw myself into a new mission, exposing the truth. Lisa's betrayal had been calculated and deliberate, and I was determined to show her and Paul that their actions had consequences. The first step was gathering evidence. I'd already saved the texts and photos from Lisa's phone, but I went further. I combed through our joint bank account, flagging every suspicious transaction, fancy dinners, hotel stays, even cash withdrawals that I knew weren't for groceries. Her social media painted an equally damning picture. Photos of girls' nights were peppered with subtle clues, Paul's car in the background, or a glimpse of his hand holding a drink just out of frame. She hadn't been as careful as she thought. But the real turning point came when I reached out to Paul's wife, Emily. I found her on Facebook, her profile filled with pictures of her and Paul smiling like the perfect couple. My hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a moment before I typed the message. "Hi Emily, my name is Mark. I'm reaching out because I believe your husband, Paul, is having an affair with my wife, Lisa. I have evidence and wanted to discuss it with you." Her response came faster than I expected. "What? Are you sure?" I sent her the screenshots, my heart pounding as I hit send. There was a long pause before her next message came through. "Can you talk? We spoke that night. Emily's voice was shaky but calm as I walked her through everything I'd discovered. She asked questions, her composure faltering when I mentioned the Super Bowl. "He told me he was going with friends," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He never mentioned Lisa." By the end of the conversation, we were on the same page. Emily was furious, not just at Paul but at the sheer audacity of their deceit. Together, we came up with a plan to confront them, and to make sure their actions didn't go unnoticed. A week later, I invited Lisa and Paul to dinner under the guise of reconciliation. "I think we should all sit down and talk this out," I told Lisa, my tone carefully measured. "No yelling, no drama, just adults trying to figure things out." She hesitated, but the hope in her eyes was unmistakable. "You really think that's a good idea?" "I do," I said. "Let's try to find some closure." Of course, Paul would be there, too. I made sure of it. "He's involved, so he should be part of the conversation," I reasoned. Lisa agreed without much convincing, likely thinking I was caving to their narrative of mistakes and misunderstandings. What Lisa didn't know was that Emily would be joining us. Paul had no clue she'd been looped in, nor that the truth they'd worked so hard to keep hidden was about to be laid bare. The restaurant was quiet, tucked away in a corner of the city. I chose it intentionally, intimate enough for confrontation but public enough to ensure no one could storm out in a fit of rage. Lisa and Paul arrived first, Paul wearing that same cocky smile that used to seem harmless. He greeted me like we were old friends. "Hey, man. Glad we're finally talking things through." I said nothing, just gestured for them to sit. Minutes later, Emily walked in, her posture rigid but her face calm. Paul's grin faltered as his eyes darted between her and me. "What's she doing here?" he asked, his voice a little too loud for comfort. "She deserves to be part of this conversation," I replied, my voice cool. "After all, it involves her, too." Lisa's smile disappeared entirely. She fidgeted with her napkin, avoiding Emily's gaze. We made small talk at first, though the tension was palpable. Paul tried to steer the conversation toward neutral topics, but neither Emily nor I played along. Lisa stayed quiet, glancing nervously at her phone every few minutes. Finally, I broke the silence. "I thought we could start by clearing the air," I said, pulling out my phone and placing it on the table. Lisa and Paul exchanged a quick, panicked look. "What do you mean?" Lisa asked, her voice tight. I pressed play. The audio recording of their Super Bowl escapade filled the room. At first it was just muffled whispers and laughter, but then the unmistakable sounds of their betrayal echoed clearly. Lisa's face turned ghostly pale, her hand flying to her mouth. Paul's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he glanced around the restaurant. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "This," I said evenly, "is the moment you both decided our marriages weren't worth respecting." I thought it might be a good starting point for our talk. Lisa tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at me, pleading silently for mercy. Paul, however, wasn't as composed. "This is illegal. You can't just record people without their consent," he spat. Emily, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, "in this state, it's perfectly legal to record audio in a public place. But don't worry, Paul. This is just the beginning." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward him. "Divorce papers," she said flatly. "I want you out of the house by tomorrow." Paul's confidence crumbled. "Emily, wait. Let's not do anything drastic." "Drastic?" Emily interrupted, her tone icy. "What's drastic is lying to me for months while you slept with his wife." She jabbed a finger toward me, her composure cracking for the first time. "You're lucky all I'm asking for is the house." Lisa, meanwhile, was crumbling under the weight of her own guilt. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Mark, please," she begged. "It was a mistake. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." "I'm sure you would," I replied coldly. "But it's too late for that. I've already filed for divorce." Her face fell, her tears coming harder now. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "Actually, I do," I said, leaning back in my chair. "And thanks to the laws in this state, infidelity works against you in court. With the evidence I've collected, you'll be walking away with next to nothing." Lisa's sobs grew louder, drawing the attention of a nearby table. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she realized the full extent of her choices. The cherry on top. I turned to Paul, who was glaring at me like he wanted to punch me across the table. "By the way," I said, my voice calm, "I sent everything, texts, photos, and this recording, to your employer." His face drained of color. "They have a strict morality clause, don't they?" I continued, feigning curiosity. "I imagine they'll be very interested to know how you've been spending your time." "You son of a," Paul started, but Emily cut him off. "Don't bother," she snapped. "You've already lost. Just accept it and leave." When the dinner ended, Lisa and Paul shuffled out of the restaurant, their heads hung low. Emily and I stayed behind, sharing a moment of quiet triumph. "Thank you," she said softly, raising her glass to me. "For telling me the truth." "You deserve to know," I replied, clinking my glass against hers. The fallout was swift and satisfying. Paul lost his job within a week, his reputation in tatters. Emily moved forward with her divorce, gaining sole custody of their kids and the house. As for Lisa, the divorce proceedings were as painful as I'd predicted, for her. She tried to appeal, to argue for more, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the end of it, she was left with little more than her clothes and a bruised ego. I kept the house, my savings, and my dignity. Sitting on my porch a month later, a beer in hand, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer consumed me. Revenge had been served, cold and calculated. So, what do you think? Did I go too far, or was it justice? Would you have done anything differently?